Tēnā koutou katoa, ko taranaki te maunga, ko waiwakai o te awa. No ngā motu aho, ki pōneki tōku kāinga anainei, ko Dohig ko Kowalchuk, ngā ingoa whānau. Ko Rachel Kowalchuk Dohig tōku ingoa, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So kia ora everyone. First up, I want to say a big thank you to Community Housing Aotearoa for asking me to speak. This is my first of the CHA conferences, and if you're anything like me, you're kind of already saturated with information, so I understand if you're already at maximum capacity. You'll see on, I was going to say the menu, but the timetable, that it's a bit of a shorter session today. I was initially going to share it with another speaker, so we've got a bit of buffer, so I'll make sure to leave some time for questions once I finish speaking. So if anything comes up for you while I'm talking, just store that away and we can come back to that later. So to start us off, you'll have heard some of my colleagues speak over the duration of this conference. So I'm one of the researchers who's working on the Public Housing and Urban Regeneration Maximising Wellbeing Research Programme. So Philippa yesterday in her keynote sort of spoke broadly to what this research program is about. So I'll try not to repeat too much, but I do want to start there. I want to look a bit more broadly, and then I'm going to hone down on some of the findings of my particular project, which sits within this much larger body of research. So with that, let's look at the bigger program. Great. So this is, as Philippa said, a really significant piece of research. It's going over 5 years, which in the research landscape is a really important length of time to make sure that we get a lot of sort of continual data and have options of working with a lot of providers and making sure that we're working in a way that works for our partners as well as us as researchers. So we're working with 7 public housing providers all around the Motu. I'm going to keep using the term public housing because we've both got sort of state-run and then CHIPs involved, so I'm just going to use a collective term because we've got tenants from a big pool. So thank you again to all those providers involved. I really want to start there, and I know I'm speaking to a room of community housing providers. This kind of research is, I hope, a really reciprocal arrangement, and it's really important for us to gather that kind of evidence to help inform practice and policy going forward, and I hope that it's also a really useful tool for those people who are involved. So within the wider program, there's a huge number of projects, from those that look at travel patterns and transport access for tenants, which is a really key issue, through to the more sort of qualitative side, the interviews with tenants and getting some of that in-person data that are looking at sort of the equivalent of what placemaking looks like in a public housing setting. So we've got a real community emphasis there. But having set the scene, what I'm here to talk about is my master's project that I finished up a couple of months ago. So this is still the wider program, but we're looking at, I always get overwhelmed when I see this, but luckily there's a lot of people involved. So we've got a lot of streams and a lot of questions, and some of that data is emerging, some of those papers are emerging. So if you are interested, please engage with the team and engage with some of that, because some of that is already available and starting conversations. So yeah, cool. So my project, I was interested in how public housing tenants have fared over the last few years and over COVID particularly. There's not that much literature in this area right now. There is some data and some research that has engaged with the public housing community. There's quite a few really important articles that came out during the first lockdown period. There was sort of online data collected with low-income New Zealanders that really spoke to some of the hardships that they faced in those early stages of the pandemic. But in terms of the particular public housing tenant population, there just hasn't been all that much exploration. So this is sort of a scoping project. I wanted to speak with some tenants, I wanted to get their perspective, and I wanted to look what that might mean moving forward. So I've called this presentation Taking Stock and Making Plans, and I hope that I did a little bit of both. I really wanted to capture that picture, because even reflecting on COVID as the pandemic continues, some of those measures can feel like a really long time ago, but in the case of some, it was actually just a matter of months ago that they occurred. The traffic light system officially ended while I was in the middle of interviews. So for the majority of the conversations I had, those COVID measures were still a lived daily reality for people. So existing research has shown us, you've got some of this up here, but that the public health and social measures enacted due to COVID-19 affected groups of people differently, with housing a likely factor in these disparities. So those of you who worked in the sector will have seen this firsthand, and certainly for other communities, including the homeless population, this has been broadly spoken about and is a very obvious example of how some groups were disproportionately affected. So, yeah, as I said, to my knowledge, there isn't much research in this area. So myself and my supervisors thought it would be an important addition, an important kōrero to start. I'm sure that within housing providers and tenant communities, there have been ongoing discussions about COVID and what that's meant and what has worked and hasn't. But in terms of the academic literature and the research sector, there's not all that much sitting there. So to carry out the project, I worked with 3 public housing providers in the Greater Wellington region, and I recruited tenants via a large tenant survey. So we'd put out a large tenant survey within the different providers we were working with. And the final question there was if those tenants were happy for us to reach out about further research opportunities. So from that, they'd already given their information and consent, and so I could call up and recruit people by that means, which was a really effective means for speaking with tenants and being able to describe the project before we engaged on that research if they were interested. So I successfully recruited 7 participants, so it is a really small group of people. We had long, in-depth conversations, but it's definitely, in quite a qualitative lens, a lot of depth of data, but not all that much breadth. And I acknowledge that for Auckland providers specifically, the COVID measures and the stringency of the COVID measures occurred for a much longer period, so they might have particular difficulties based on that might not have been captured as this was a Wellington pool of people. So I'm going to walk you through some of my findings, in particular a list of recommendations that I developed for public housing providers. I want to flag and really emphasise here that I also developed a secondary list that was aimed at policymakers because some of the issues raised by tenants would be better addressed at a policy level, particularly in regard to food insecurity, which were some of my key findings. And there's sort of a need for, as I'll get onto, but the kind of cross-sectoral considerations and where there were gaps in support, whose responsibility is to fill those spaces and what does that look like going forward, and those conversations that need to happen. So I've just put this up here because these were some of the key themes that emerged as I was talking with tenants. So well-being is a key idea within the larger research program, and it was a key idea within this project. I think well-being is used in a lot of different contexts and a lot of different lights. But as I understand it, well-being refers to an individual and whānau's ability to be well on their own terms in the context of the people, places and relationships in their lives. So it's therefore necessarily specific to each circumstance and includes considerations of agency, power dynamics and infrastructure in the ways that they do or do not allow a person or whānau to be well. So far from being vague, well-being was kind of the core idea that allowed for these interviews to stretch, for the conversations to move between the interactions of the tenant, their household, the characteristics of their dwelling and COVID-19. And so it's really important to note Māori understandings of well-being and that the cornerstones of Hauora and Te Ao Māori they're sort of weighted with equal importance, and that Western models often prioritise the physical over everything else. So I really wanted to allow the tenants to define that for themselves and bring in their own cultural understandings. So you can see a lot of these are not surprising. A lot of the themes that emerged I think ring quite true and speak to a lot of people's own experience or a lot of the other dialogue that's been occurring. But something I really wanted to note was that everyone I spoke to spoke about their greatest sense of uncertainty about what was around the corner. Even though we were speaking at that time quite a long period after the lockdowns while we were in the traffic light system, I think, it's really worth continuing to remember what a significant period COVID was. I think because it is such an intersection of crises in this sector, there's cost of living, there's housing, there was COVID. It's really easy to move on and address what's occurring right now, but I think it really is important to consider the ways that the COVID-19 period was sort of not necessarily a bend in the road, but it's just such a significant thing that moving forward there have been ongoing changes from that. And that tenants really spoke about their experience in relation to others, especially those who were worse off than themselves. And they reflected on their experiences in Aotearoa compared to those in other countries. So while they spoke on their own experience, their concerns were actually often much more broad than themselves, particularly in regards to those with children. They spoke at length about the difficulties of looking after their children through this period and their concern for the future. So with that, I'm gonna walk you through some of the recommendations that I developed based on this. So, good quality housing is my first point here. So, the first point to emphasise is the continued need for warm, dry and mould-free public housing. So I know that I'm preaching to the converted, but it is really important, so long as tenants are based in some of these dwellings, to just remember and continue the conversation about the reality of some of the spaces that some of the low-income people in New Zealand are still living in. So there is a large and growing body of evidence demonstrating the negative health consequences of poor quality substandard housing. And I know that that's not going to come as a surprise to anyone in the room. You'll see up on the screen 2 quotes from tenants who I spoke to regarding the dwellings that they were living in. So to the left, Joe, and I'll just note that it's not those tenants' real names, they're all pseudonym, all the names you hear today. He noted that he had such a significant mould problem that it created a hole through the wall of his dwelling. So he noted his relief that as an essential worker, he was able to leave his home over the lockdown period, meaning he was not stuck in these unpleasant conditions for weeks on end. So a lot of that rings true to stories you would have heard of other situations, but just to put that specifically in the context of COVID, I think it's really interesting to consider that sort of the unprecedented restrictions and limitations of movement meant that people were actually inside their dwellings for much longer periods of time. And so for those that were in substandard housing, the sort of effects of that were amplified for them just due to those measures and the periods of time that people were based in their spaces. So for this reason, among many others, ensuring all public and community housing tenants have access to good quality housing that meets minimum standards should remain at the top of providers' agenda going forward. So in second consideration, is the need for dwelling interiors to be flexible to changing uses. So that was something that a lot of tenants spoke about. So some of the changes that were talked about were working or studying from home. I know a lot of us also experienced that firsthand. Households needing to isolate one member of the household from the rest of the household due to being contagious or ill, and I'll come back to that. And also that some of the people I spoke to, their actual household makeup had changed over those periods, particularly due to a family member who could not look after themselves in another location or had an unstable housing, so moved into their accommodation for one or both of the lockdown periods. So I think the second finding is particularly interesting, which was to do with isolating an unwell housemate. And there's a lot of international literature addressing that. There's actually quite a lot from sort of bigger cities with more medium and high density accommodation, where the sort of floor space per person is a lot more limited. And I think that's quite interesting because it speaks to functional space, not necessarily in terms of size or even the thermal, even the thermal envelope of a dwelling, but by what you can do with that space, and in this case, the ability for spaces to be separated and what that means. And as more people continue to work from home, I think these considerations about flexibility and versatility of space may have increased relevance in everyday life, as well as during pandemic restrictions. So that I think is more of a going concern. So this has actually been spoken about, what I've called access to outdoor space, one of the key themes. And this has been spoken about a bit in this conference already in regards to wellbeing in other ways. It's something that we talk about a lot, especially for urban-based people, access to outdoor space. But as it relates to COVID, this was a really key finding and something that recurred throughout the literature, was the need for particularly urban spaces and everyone to have access to outdoor space during those restrictions. So access to outdoor space was not just facilitated by providers, I will say that, and by the structures of people's buildings, but also by wider urban infrastructure. So local parks, walkways, green and blue space were really key for tenants to staying well. And those with children particularly noted how important it was to be able to get outside somewhere safe with their children. So alongside the reinforcement of the importance of outdoor space, tenant stories also demonstrated some barriers that they faced that might emerge during pandemic restrictions. So particularly navigating the risk of transmission between households. So that was something that was a real concern for those based in medium density dwellings and shared spaces like hallways and staircases. And some tenants spoke with quite a lot of anxiety about their experience of navigating that with their neighbours, particularly when their neighbours had different masking choices than their own. And they felt quite powerless as it was sort of this intermediary space, so they didn't necessarily feel they had agency to ask that of their neighbours. Which brings up some questions around provider policy and who has the authority to ask that of the residents, and how do, tenants who are having issues around that ask for more support so that they do feel empowered to share these spaces and be safe in these spaces. So yeah, there's many reasons why green space is important, but unsurprisingly, it was also really important during pandemic restrictions. So I actually hadn't included any specific questions about pets, but tenants were really keen to speak to me about that, which I think emphasises their importance for those people. Sort of unprompted, I got a lot of information about the real importance of people's pets to their well-being. So I've included this image here as it was provided by Joe, as he described the significant positive impact that having a dog had on his well-being during the second lockdown. So he had got a dog and he had moved providers in order to do so between the two lockdown periods, meaning he could compare his experiences with and without a pet. And for him, it really was night and day. We've got a quote from him there saying, "It's what keeping me sane." He was a solo bubble, and loneliness was a sort of marked feature of his experience of COVID. And so having this dog was a huge asset in staying well at this time. Another participant who was based in a provider who didn't allow pets spoke at length about the positive impact that she believed having a pet would have had on her and her young child had they been allowed one during the stay-at-home orders. So I know that there are a lot of considerations when it comes to pet policy, particularly whether tenants are allowed to have large animals at homes like cats or dogs. But I did want to make sure to note that for some tenants, pets have played a significant role in supporting wellbeing since the start of the pandemic. So I've come to my final 2 points, and these are the most critical really, and they concern support systems and tenant food insecurity. So discussions of food insecurity emerged from early on in my interviews. Emma, in particular, spoke at length about how some of her elderly neighbours had gone weeks without groceries at the start of the first lockdown and were in really dire straits. So in response to this, impromptu neighbourhood support systems in her community developed, so those neighbours who could access food and access supermarkets in Wellington are knocking on each other's doors and helping those out who were in food insecurity and in need. And notably, as the pandemic progressed, not-for-profit organisations such as food banks filled this initially unmet need and started supporting tenants in Emma's community. But this really brings me on to my second point, which is support systems. So something interesting that came out of the interviews was the disconnect I found between what some tenants believed their provider's duty of care was during the pandemic and what their provider's actual responsibility was. So, for example, 2 of the participants noted how providers had, in Joe's words, really dropped the ball. They considered their providers to have dropped the ball by not supporting those tenants experiencing food insecurity during the first lockdown. And despite Joe and Emma's comments, in actuality, supporting tenants' grocery needs is outside most public and community housing providers' scope, so that's not something that they necessarily offer. That I know that within the CHIP sector there's a wider range of community supports, but it's not universal between CHIPs and between public housing providers. But this really brought up further questions for me. Outside of pandemic, are there misperceptions by tenants about the responsibilities of care? And if there are gaps in social support services like those disclosed by Emma, how can we work collectively to address these and communicate most effectively to tenants where the support lies, because some of that just seems like a disconnect between what these tenants knew was available to them and what they actually accessed. So while on the one hand, community-led solutions such as that which occurred in Emma's building, such as the impromptu support system, show the organisation and collective action of tenants, it is inappropriate sort of as a society to expect individuals already facing economic marginalisation to have to bear the brunt of supporting others when systems are failing to do so. So I just think, it was really interesting to hear where some of those gaps were and also consider that in some of those grey areas, particularly in regard to food insecurity and particularly in regard to lockdown measures, where there are just, those totally unprecedented restrictions placed. How do we better engage with communities immediately to make sure that basic supports are met? This isn't one of my broader recommendations, though it is touched on in my thesis, but it seems like a good forum to discuss that some security concerns were also raised by tenants who I spoke to. So tenants described witnessing both breaches of the COVID-19 measures and a number of illegal activities occurring on provider sites during the lockdown periods. So the particular tenant who raised this felt unsafe due to these behaviours, but struggled to access support or even to know who to ask for help. They were unsure who they should reach out to. It was unclear to them whether it was the provider or the police who they should be contacting about these lockdown breaches, and they felt unheard and ultimately their needs were not met. So I think, again, this is a sort of cross-sectoral question, but the need to thoroughly communicate support pathways and make sure that those are in place is a really important step going forward. So that brings me on to this, which is kind of the list that I came up with that I've just spoken through. So I feel like all of those things are really huge in their own right, and I've sort of just brushed the surface, but hopefully that's painted a picture of some of the key things that emerged from tenant conversations. In the policy list, there's a range of other considerations, but I thought that those really particular to tenant experience and really particular to their lived experience of their dwelling were those that might be most interesting to yourselves here. And I guess I'm sort of ending with a question, which is that given that we know public housing tenants struggled with food insecurity and who to go to for help when feeling unsafe during the lockdown, how can we do better to serve this community next time? So we use the term unprecedented, I think I just did it before, too often, but we use it frequently to describe our experience of the pandemic. But this won't be the case going forward. COVID-19 has now set a precedent, and that it's important that lessons are learned from these last few years and that these inform our next steps. This is really a collective effort. There needs to be collaboration and planning between tenants, providers and not-for-profits to ensure that support systems are in place and fit for purpose. So kia ora, thank you everyone. In a very researcher way, I've got lots of references here. Thank you so much, Community Housing Aotearoa, again. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was
good.
very informative. And I think from one person doing a master's to somebody just finished a master's, very well done. I really enjoyed hearing about your research and everything that you did. We do have some time for questions. If anybody would like to offer some questions up to Rachel, put your hand up and I'll come around with the mic. Anyone? Any takers?
Hey, Neville.
So I guess my comment or thought is around that last question of how do we organise the support and also the role. I guess one of the things we haven't talked about is that the role of housing providers quite often has to be separate from the support. So certainly if you think of a housing first model or for people with very high and a lot of the people in community housing have very high mental health needs and some addictions. That actually, if we can, there is many advantages for mainstream of separating out the housing role and the support role. But then it's making clear if we're doing the housing role, how do we say to them the support role is done by X, or who steps up
Yep.
when the support role is stepping back?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's been a really interesting consideration and probably something that's recurred throughout a lot of the presentations this weekend, actually, speaking to the people's here role as providers, but also in reality all the other services that they may provide for their tenants or coordinate for their tenants, and how we do that in a way that's really effective and clear cut so that all those needs are being met.
I think Neville stole probably half of my question, but I think there's still something in there, which was, in England we're having a big reflection about what is the role of social housing providers, right? And some are very clear that we are just housing providers and we don't have any wider role, and others we are place shapers, we are this, there's quite a wide role. But I suppose my question really was, but it was a reflection on what some providers were telling me is about how, because of austerity, as social services begin to retreat, often the housing provider is the only person that looks kind of public that some of our tenants might still have access to. I just suppose in that context, it links to that. How do we try and sort of navigate roles within sort of quite a difficult situation?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question, I think. And I guess I only touched on it briefly, but it really did strike me that tenants, and again, a small pool of tenants, so some of the tenants I spoke to were quite unaware of the role that their provider was filling during the pandemic. So it seemed sort of both that they felt their provider had fallen short, but were also unsure of what they could expect and could ask for. So it was kind of that, it was partly that lack of clarity. And I think it was also maybe kind of even more hazy than that, just how we understand social housing providers and how they're spoken about versus, I guess, the mechanisms within them. So it felt like almost like a social consideration of the tenants and a little bit of haziness about roles and responsibilities and how they're understood. So it did make me wonder about, I guess it's a wider question about how all those needs are met, how systems can work effectively, but also how can we communicate to tenants, because it felt like a lot of them had felt excluded from some of the conversations, or that the pathways were just not clear for them accessing help on some of those concerns. I was aware of pathways they actually could have drawn on, but it was looking back and discussing with them, but they clearly weren't aware of that. So that disconnect was really apparent, which is probably more of a question than an answer, but yeah.
Sorry, just a quick observation.
Yeah.
We have villages all throughout the country, Salvation Army here. It's interesting speaking to some of our tenants. They felt for the first time the community came together through the COVID experience. They had people told stories that they never knew the tenants from over the other side of the village, but they all did walks around the village and they got to speak to each other, and the younger ones looked after the older ones, did their shopping, etc. And I heard that story over and over again. And I think that was a reflection of some chips really worked hard.
Absolutely.
Well, we work hard at creating community. That's sort of the thing that binds us together.
Absolutely.
Whānau together. But I think it's a shame that those sort of messages didn't come out there, because I think a lot of chips would say their tenants had a positive community experience through that COVID time.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for pointing that out. I really appreciate that. And I think because of the particular questions that I was asking and the conversations we were having, we probably strayed more towards the negative side of their experience. I mean, they wanted to take the opportunity to express some of their concerns, but you're absolutely right. Absolutely. And to acknowledge that, and I understand that the sector worked incredibly hard over that period. So I did not mean it all to be disparaging of that, just to acknowledge some of the concerns that were raised to me in those conversations. They felt like the key things to discuss today, but thank you. That is a really good thing to point out. Yeah.
Hi. I just had a question. I know you had quite a small pool of people that you interviewed. Did access to internet and information come up as something that was a problem for these people, and the decision of what to pay for when they were paying for their bills, internet versus food and stuff like that?
There wasn't too much description of sort of juggling cost, but in the same conversation about supporting elderly neighbours with groceries, there was some discussion about neighbours they knew who didn't have access to Wi-Fi. So they talked about, I think most of the providers that I worked with mainly use text communication, seemed to be the main form, and no one spoke to me about not having access to those messages. But they did acknowledge people in their neighbourhood who didn't have Wi-Fi access, and therefore mainly got their information via the provider rather than via some of the national outlets, some of the government outlets, which were mainly communicated online. So yeah, I think that will be an interesting follow-up question, actually. I didn't get all that much data on it, but definitely that we do know that some groups in the community have less access to those services. And they were a key platform in communicating some of the COVID measures, so that brings up a lot of questions about who may not have access to some of those. Yeah.
Hi, Richard. So this don't have any question or any comment. I just want to share how we, what we did like during that pandemic situation, and just a reflection. Like I'm from Tihara Moai, so there's a new chip that established in October 2020, and what we, so obviously it was after the first pandemic waves, and so in the second lockdown and third lockdown, like we had a team of relationship managers. We called relationship managers, not the tenancy managers.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all about the visions and the values of your organizations, like how far you go for your tenants.
Yeah.
From our board and from our top management, that was a key focus, that make sure we have the list of our vulnerable tenants, and we do check on them on regular basis, even though we were working from home. And we had a list of all the social, these assistance providers for our locally, in the local area. So obviously we checked on everyone, let's say 20 in a day or something, and we provided all the necessities that what they need, like especially food and those things. Just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that. And absolutely, it's been really interesting to discuss with different providers, as I've met various of you over the last few days and hear, the different mechanisms there. And absolutely, many providers are really rooted in their community, and those existing support networks and their tenants benefit from those kind of relationships. So that's really wonderful to hear.
Hi, Rachel. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
A couple of comments. I mean, obviously, during the pandemic, there were kind of extreme measures, so that we weren't able to evict anyone in any case. So the whole role of community housing providers changed, and I know you couldn't do certain maintenance. So I think most organisations remobilised. But I think if I go back to the very first question, I don't think we've addressed what the role of being a good community housing provider is, and how much support that includes. I think that's the bit we have to look at. And to me, I think we need to work that out and kind of normalise what is the right kind of support as part of tenancy management. It's relationship management. If your tenants aren't eating, you should be doing food. And that's different from what we talk about wraparound support, but no one really defines what that separation is. So I think this separation of housing support has stopped us having that conversation, and I think we should have a really good look at that. And I think actually many providers are now including much more of that kind of responsibility in their roles. That's why we've got relationship managers rather than tenancy managers.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Do we have any other questions in the room? All right. I think we're happy to wrap up there. If everybody would,
Thank you very much.